1.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. My name is John Glisson, and happy Friday. I'm going to be talking with you about what is new in BizTalk Server 2020. So coming to you from Atlanta, where it is unseasonably cool and rainy today, but I will take it because it's going to be hot Atlanta before long, I can promise you. So moving right along, what we first want to answer is the question for those of you who don't know, what is BizTalk Server? Well, BizTalk Server is an integration platform that is from Microsoft, and it is what is commonly known as message-oriented middleware. That's the fancy term. But what that means is it supports several enterprise integration patterns, also publish and subscribe patterns, message transformation, message routing, and workflow management. And all of those terms might not mean much to you, but this this graphic here can give a kind of an overview of where BizTalk Server fits within an enterprise for integration purposes. So here you can see we got cloud, we've got on-premises systems, we've got what are known as line of business systems, so legacy systems such as IBM, SAP, Oracle, or other integration platforms such as TIBCO, and lots of standards support within Microsoft BizTalk Server, such as EDI, SL7, HL7, Swift, RosettaNet, and other standards that are used for integration scenarios. So BizTalk Server supports internal systems-to-systems integration as well as external business-to-business integrations, and it's used in both of those integration spaces quite heavily. So moving on to the kinds of problems that we solve with BizTalk Server, this is a typical point-to-point integration diagram, and you can see we have lots of tightly coupled systems. We have a CRM, an accounting system, a fulfillment system, purchasing, ERP, etc. And as an enterprise grows over time, it's not uncommon to create a single line of integration between one system and another, and you end up with lots of tightly coupled duplicated endpoints. And it's relatively easy to develop this way in silos, but over time as an enterprise grows, it becomes very difficult to maintain and not resilient to changes, because if I have to make a change to my data warehouse, then every other system that integrates with that data warehouse will need to make a change. And so that is not resilient to change and becomes very difficult to maintain over time. So bringing in BizTalk Server, these are a couple of architectures that would solve that solution. So we have the data warehouse where we have one endpoint that integrates with the data warehouse from BizTalk Server, and everything else uses BizTalk Server as a hub and spoke in this scenario. Another common architecture would be the enterprise service bus in this case, which larger organizations which want even more decoupling and have lots of systems or external systems that they have to integrate with, this might be a more attractive architecture for some organizations, depending on what their requirements are. Then moving on to actually what is new with BizTalk 2020, as opposed to some of the other versions, the older versions. The first of which is that it supports Visual Studio 2019, which is the most recent release of Visual Studio. BizTalk Server does get tied to a version of Visual Studio as its development platform. The support for Windows has been updated as well. So Windows Server 2019 is supported for BizTalk 2020, as well as 2016 and Windows 10 for a development environment. Moving on, SQL Server supports SQL Server 2019, as well as reaching back into 2017 and 2016 SP2 to support BizTalk Server. BizTalk can integrate with older versions of SQL Server for application integration, but these are the versions that BizTalk Server itself would run on top of. BizTalk Server has its own set of SQL Server databases to maintain the platform, and these are the versions that can be used in setting up BizTalk Server. There are also support for additional versions of Office for certain features of BizTalk, Business Activity Monitoring, namely, or BAM, that are optional, but BizTalk Server 2020 is able to use Office 2019 components for its BAM business process monitoring. So moving on into analytics, there are some enhanced features in BizTalk 2020 that are actually quite nice for operational data monitoring and analytics. So previously, everything was kind of in the box of BizTalk, and you would have to report directly out of BizTalk to get some of the analytics of what's happening inside of the server. Now that data can be published out to Azure Application Insights or to Event Hubs to monitor BizTalk applications. And then that data can be surfaced using Power BI, which can create some much more attractive reporting opportunities and ability to create KPIs and measures for the integrations that are occurring within your BizTalk server. If you needed to measure things like service level agreements and things like that for your integrations, you're now able to do that with Power BI, which gives you much greater flexibility for reporting on the activity within your BizTalk server environment. One thing that is a big term these days is DevOps. You hear DevOps mentioned pretty much throughout our industry, and Azure DevOps being a platform that is commonly used on the Microsoft stack. Now Azure DevOps is available as a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline for BizTalk Server. So as BizTalk developers would check in code into a branch in Git per se, within Azure DevOps, that could then be picked up by a pipeline to deploy the application to a BizTalk server that is running inside of a VM in Azure. So those are actually some exciting features because with many integration servers, continuous integration, continuous delivery has not been an easy story. And so the changes in BizTalk 2020 really smooths out that CI/CD pipeline story quite a bit, which is definitely a great update to the product. One other additional feature here is the BizTalk Management REST API that comes with BizTalk 2020. So this basically gives you a full Swagger supported REST API for managing just about everything inside of the BizTalk server. And I have a demo of that briefly, where I'm just going to pull up the Swagger document for the server. And so this is Swagger document. For those of you who have done any web service development or REST API development, you would potentially recognize Swagger. So here you can look at many of the features inside of BizTalk. And if you've ever done any BizTalk development, for those of you that have, you'll recognize some of these. We've got our orchestrations where we can do a get of our orchestrations and see the list of the orchestrations that have been deployed inside of BizTalk. And it looks like this is the first time that I've run this here today, so it's going to take it just a second for IIS to spin up, but here we go. So we can see now I've got a nice JSON document that's giving me all of the orchestrations that are deployed inside of the product. I've got a Scratch project that I've deployed, and so this is a Scratch purchase order, process purchase order orchestration that I have deployed. And so here you can do lots of operational activities through the REST API. For instance, if you needed to stop or start a host instance, these are things that sometimes you have to bounce an instance. Or if you want to manage your parties for your EDI agreements, if you needed to look at your schemas or your maps, also known as transforms, and you wanted to look at the maps that were deployed. Lots of information here that you can avail yourself to through the API. Send ports, receive ports, the same thing. You can start, stop, enlist, unenlist, send ports, receive locations, the same thing. You can start and stop, enable or disable receive locations. So these are all features within BizTalk that you can now enable lots of interesting scenarios without having to actually go into the administration console. This is previously where you would have to do these activities to start and stop, enable or disable a receive location or a send port, etc. Now you can do programmatically through an API. So that's actually a really interesting feature that I think some interesting problems will be solved using that API in the future. So moving right along, again, new features in BizTalk Server. We've got new security features. One of the things now, BizTalk supports always encrypted columns. So always encrypted is a feature that came into existence with SQL Server a couple of versions ago that allows basically the data at rest to be encrypted, always encrypted, so that when it is brought into the application, it is decrypted for use by the app, but once it is at rest in SQL Server, it is always encrypted. And so now BizTalk Server can take advantage of the always encrypted feature through the WCF SQL adapter within BizTalk Server. And additionally, new SQL Server, new security features are the addition of TLS 1.2. This is something that was actually added in a cumulative update in the previous version, but now it is baked into BizTalk 2020 as the default to use TLS 1.2 for authentication, encryption, and decryption. So again, tighter security, a thing that's on everybody's mind with any IT system today is security, and so these are some greater security features added to BizTalk 2020. One, what seems like a small feature add, but for those of us, such as myself, who've used BizTalk for a while, this is a quite an interesting feature, is the addition of improved capabilities for scheduling. So previously there were service windows enabled, but you didn't have this recurrence feature. And I will actually, in a demo later, we'll pull up a receive port and show you a little bit more of the features that are in this scheduling, but this is something that's worth calling out if you have processes that you only want to run on a weekly or twice a week or first Monday of the month. Those kinds of scenarios, now you can schedule for those integrations to work on those kinds of flexible schedules rather than just, you know, between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. Every day, which was what you were able to do before. So that's actually an interesting feature. As I mentioned, BizTalk Server has several SQL Server databases that it relies upon. Well, with any database, you need to back that SQL database up. Now, BizTalk 2020 databases can be backed up to Azure Blob storage, which, when you're running BizTalk in the cloud, is definitely a great addition. You no longer have to attach a drive letter storage or a UNC path to back things up. You can instead back them up directly to Azure Blob storage, which just makes it a lot easier to run BizTalk Server in the cloud in an Azure infrastructure as a service scenario. And speaking of the cloud, there are a few new cloud adapters that have been added to the product specifically around Microsoft Azure. 3 adapters in particular. There's a new Azure Service Bus adapter that allows BizTalk Server to send and receive messages from the Azure Service Bus, such as the queues, topics, and relays that would be in the Azure Service Bus. Azure Event Hubs. This is really interesting because it would allow BizTalk Server to participate in IoT applications and mobile applications, which would use event-driven architectures. And so the Azure Event Hubs is actually a really interesting addition to the product. And previously mentioned Azure Blob Storage for backups. Also now BizTalk Server can send and receive directly from Azure Blob Storage to enable hybrid integrations from a file perspective. Also, additional adapters are Office 365. Now, BizTalk can leverage Office 365 automation workflows by sending or receiving Office 365 emails, sending or receiving Office 365 calendar events, or even creating Office 365 contacts using these new adapters. So the emails is probably going to be the most prominent, where notifications that need to be sent out of the server for one reason or another can be sent through Office 365. And actually, this is moving forward going to be a preferred method above SMTP, and that actually will be later on, where we'll talk about some of the deprecated and removed aspects of the platform. SMTP has not been removed, but it is one that is kind of slowly being deprecated, favoring the Office 365 integration for emails. So moving on from there, I actually wanted to get into a demo of BizTalk, and demos of BizTalk, I will warn you ahead of time, aren't very shiny and exciting, because basically a message will come in from one area or from one location and it will show up in another. So I will have some things turned off so we can actually see the movement happening, but BizTalk demos are notorious for being I won't say boring, because I do BizTalk all the time, but not exciting. How about that? So here I have a receive location in BizTalk that is listening to an Azure Blob storage container. And here I have it disabled because I want to actually see the message. So in our diagram, we see that we have, say, an e-commerce application that is going to send a message through an Azure function. Then that Azure function is going to drop that message onto Azure Blob Storage. Here in parens, I mentioned Azure Service Bus or the Azure Event Hub, because those are perfectly acceptable destinations for that message also. But for the purposes of this demo, I have it dropping into Azure Blob Storage. Then BizTalk Server is going to pick up that message. It's going to send it out as an email, and it is going to take that message and transform it into a SQL Server database, an application database. So my e-commerce application in this case is going to be Postman, where I have this message as essentially a purchase order with a couple of purchase order lines, and I'm going to send this message through an Azure function. How do I know it's an Azure function? Well, because right here it says Azure function. So this is sending this message to an Azure function. Then that function is going to take that message and write it into Azure Blob Storage. And there the message is here. We can see it arrived here at 1:18 p.m. and I am in the Eastern time zone. So if you're doing the time warp with me, that's great. So now it's time for me to play Nothing is Up My Sleeve. I mentioned that BizTalk demos are not very exciting, but nothing is up my sleeve. Nothing is in my SQL Server tables as I query them. But now I'm going to go and enable this receive location, and that message will get picked up and processed through the BizTalk server. Looking back over here to Azure, and actually my phone just buzzed at me, so you can see no more file. My phone just buzzed at me because it received an email. And now if I query the database, I'll see that these records have been written into the database. And in this case, it was written into a couple of tables, the order header and order line. And I have other lookup tables for customer information and product information, where it has these joins, and it did the foreign keys and so forth to populate this application database. Again, not exciting, right? But that is how it worked. And this is an example of the email that was sent. I don't want to open up Outlook Excel so I can share my inbox with the world, but this is an example of the email, and my phone did buzz at me, so I know I received it. So this is that was just a very high level demo, and literally this demo took me all of 30 minutes, maybe an hour, to set up all of these components, including the Azure function, which if you haven't messed with those, that is another lunch and learn for another day, but definitely something to delve into. All right, so moving on to other features of 2020, BizTalk 2020, are group managed service accounts. If I have any IT administrators here, network administrators, this is something that will be exciting to you. So BizTalk has several service accounts that it leverages as an environment. And now most of them, not all of them, but most of the services in BizTalk Server support group managed service accounts. And that basically enables you to run the services without having to reconfigure those services anytime a service account password changes, which can be quite cumbersome. And if a password changes for some security reason and it breaks your integrations, that can actually be a pretty serious situation for some enterprises. So enabling the use of group managed service accounts, it's literally just a checkbox in the setup of BizTalk when you're setting it up initially. But that is a great new feature that some of our clients are actually very excited about. Moving on to API management, BizTalk has the ability to publish some of its endpoints as APIs. An orchestration or a schema can be published as a WCF service. Now those services can be published into Azure API management, which enables you much greater control of how those APIs can be called from external sources. That's still something if a scenario was necessitated BizTalk endpoints to be published as an API, it's still something that you want to do with great care. But having API management around them does enable some greater control of how those APIs can be called and managed. So that is an interesting addition to the product. The operations audit log. This is what I like to call whodunit. Basically, anytime someone turns on or off a feature inside of BizTalk, they enable or disable a send port or receive location, as I showed you, that will now be or can now be audited. It's what happened and who did it, so that if you come in and say, hey, this FTP receive hasn't run for a week, who turned it off? We never even knew. Well, now you can look at an audit log and say, hey, so-and-so, don't do that anymore. We need this to be always on. And you can run reports on this data now that can create some interesting alert scenarios that didn't exist before as well. So very, very interesting new feature for BizTalk. Again, as I like to call it, the whodunit features. Speaking of whodunit, the read-only operator role. There is, at times, there is the necessity for a business user to get onto the BizTalk server to see what's going on, or a power user within an organization to get onto the BizTalk server in production to see what's happening with a particular integration. Now there is a read-only service group that would allow users to do that without having the security ability to, really do anything. They couldn't turn anything off, turn anything on. They could just look at things in a read-only view and query the administration console. So this is something that can give some great comfort to BizTalk administrators who previous to now probably would not want to open up that access to other users, but the read-only user group can allow them to sleep at night knowing that there are users in their environment that actually can't do anything. They can just run queries. So support for Saxon XSLT 3.0. That sounds really, really fancy, and in some ways it actually kind of is. The transformation engine inside of BizTalk Server is XSLT. And that is a way of transforming XML messages from one format to another. Generally inside of BizTalk, all of the messages get transformed at some point into an XML message for mapping. Up until now, BizTalk only supported XSL 1.0, which was not a very flexible transformation language. It actually is a very powerful transformation language, but there are a lot of things that were really difficult to do in XSL 1.0 that in XSL 3.0 has a lot of new features that now you can take advantage of in BizTalk Server. And I know that a lot of the BizTalk geeks that I've talked to about this particular feature, this is the one that they were the most excited about. And I'll give you a demo of why. So this is an example of a BizTalk map. And this is a map that has what are known as functoids here. So we have a whole suite of functoids here in a toolbox that will do different things to fields in a message as they are mapped from one format to another. Well, this map is going to be set up to use the default transformation engine. But in the new version now, I can change this transformation engine to use Saxon 9, and that is the standard that allows me to use XSL3. There is one interesting caveat to it in that you'll notice that there are no lines drawn, as there are on this map. We have lines drawn and we have objects on the grid surface. There are no lines drawn and no objects, and that is because in order to use XSL3, you do have to write the XSL by hand. So it references an XSL file. And this is an example of the XSL file. So this is XSL, the XSL transformation language. And this bit right here, this aggregation, this is something that historically was very difficult to do in BizTalk. There's actually in XSL 1.0 a method called Munchen grouping, which is really, really difficult to do and really a pain in the neck. And all that really did for me was grouping. Let's say if I had this purchase order that came in and I have two different products, PR1, PR2, and I want to get a total, how many PR1s and how many PR2s did I receive? And I want to transform my message. Well, historically that was, believe it or not, kind of hard, kind of difficult to do. But now I have in the XSL3 language this for each group method, which allows me to group by my product number. And then I can use the sum, which is a normal XPath expression, to sum on that group. The output is then like this. So I've got my total ordered of product 1, 112. You can see 12 plus 100, 112. Basic math. Product 2, 102 of product 2. So it seems really like a really simple example, and it is. But previously, to actually code this to happen requires you to go through several steps to get that to happen through that Munchen grouping method that I mentioned before. This is just one small example of scratching the surface of XSL3. There are actually a lot more features than just grouping, but it's just a quick demo example of some things that have been made significantly easier in BizTalk 2020 by allowing you to use XSL3 as a transformation language. Additionally to XSL3, it is also possible to plug in your own transformation engine. Saxon does not have quite a corner on the market. There are a couple of other transformation engines that you can plug into BizTalk now through this new extensibility that they added to the maps.
I've got a question in the chat for you, John. It says,
yeah.
What is the cost model of BizTalk?
The cost model. That is a great question that I don't have the numbers to, like what it costs. The model is per core. It's not per socket, meaning per host machine. Generally today, BizTalk is being deployed on a virtual machine, either on premises or in the cloud. And the cost model is a per socket model, or I'm sorry, a per core model within the VM. So however many cores you have assigned to that VM, you would pay the licensing for each core. And generally you want somewhere in the 2 to 4 core range for a production server at a minimum to allow good multiprocessing within the server at runtime. So it's a great question though. However, the numbers I don't have. As a developer, I've been kind of shielded from the actual software sales piece of it. So we will either go to a vendor or work with Microsoft directly to get the actual quote for what the per core cost would be. So we are moving pretty quickly here through the slide deck, so hopefully there are a couple of more questions at the end. But additional updates to BizTalk. There is a move to the long-term supported OLEDB driver for SQL Server. So essentially that means that the driver that it is using has a longer life cycle before it needs to be replaced or falls out of support from Microsoft. Support for SSO affiliate applications within the SFTP adapter, that's a very specific thing, but What that basically means is you have to store passwords somewhere, and you want passwords to be kept secure. The SSO affiliate applications, SSO means single sign-on, is a part of the BizTalk Server product that allows you to store secure information within the BizTalk database in a secured encrypted way. And the SFTP adapter can now use the affiliate applications as a storage place for usernames and passwords. The SQL availability group support. This is actually a relatively big deal with the product as it relates to deploying BizTalk in the cloud. Historically, in a BizTalk high availability deployment, you'd have a couple of BizTalk application servers and a couple of SQL servers that are in a cluster, a typical SQL Server Windows cluster. Well, now in the newer versions of SQL Server, you have SQL Server always on availability groups, which allow you to have the same features of clustering within SQL Server without having to go through the overhead of creating that clustered environment. In previous versions of BizTalk, BizTalk does rely on MSDTC for transactions, long-running transactions, because it might have to span multiple systems, so it does enlist distributed transactions when it needs to. The always-on availability groups didn't support MSDTC transactions very well. But now, between upgrades in SQL Server and upgrades in BizTalk, they have met in the middle now where you can have 2 instances of SQL Server, 2 instances of BizTalk, and it can you can create a high availability configuration with just those servers. And you can do it on premises in VMs, and you can also do it in VMs in the cloud. So that's actually really nice feature. Previously, you'd have to spin up lots and lots of instances of the SQL Server to get that same functionality. There is a new state for receive locations known as partially disabled, and this is for fault tolerance. So essentially, you don't want to create a race condition. If you do have a scaled out configuration of BizTalk Server, you don't want to create a race condition between 2 different servers. So one will partially disable itself to allow one node to pick it up, and then they will go back and forth essentially to pick up messages without having to create a race condition between them. There's also throughput improvements for the dynamic send ports and order delivery through dynamic send ports, which are features that are occasionally used by workflows inside of BizTalk with orchestrations. So now coming to the last slide or two, these are the list of the deprecated and removed features. I'm not going to read through all of this, but one to be highlighted. I did mention the SMTP adapter was one that is deprecated, favored to be replaced with the Office 365 adapters. A couple of other features are there is an old SQL adapter that has actually been removed, and with good cause. There is the WCF SQL adapter has been in place for quite some time for reading and writing from SQL Server. This should really only be an issue if there's an upgrade from a much older version of BizTalk, such as 2006 and maybe 2010. Anything to 2013 and forward is probably already using the WCF SQL adapter, so that's why this has been actually removed from the platform. A couple of the older line of business adapters have been deprecated or removed, and specifically the JD Edwards One World adapter has been deprecated. The BAM portal has been deprecated. This is a feature that many of us in the BizTalk world love to hate, and we still love to hate it. It has not been removed yet, but it has been deprecated. There are actually new replacements for that functionality as well. So were there any other questions that came into chat?
Yeah, I've got a couple. One is, what are the infrastructure requirements for actually running a BizTalk server?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on the requirements of the organization and what their throughput is going to be. The simple requirements are you need to have a Windows server. I mentioned the versions of 2016 forward, I believe it was. And you can run BizTalk Server and SQL Server all in one box. And that is the way that pretty much any developer is likely to set up their development environment that way. QA environment is often set up that way. There are smaller installations of BizTalk that are set up that way in production, where they don't necessarily have high availability requirements. They might have a hot cold scenario where they have two of those with one of them spun down and they keep an instance running. And if they needed to recover, then and there was an outage of that for some reason, they could bring the other up. A more typical scenario is going to be a BizTalk server and a SQL server on separate servers, separate actual VMs or hardware, typically VMs. And that is what you'll see most of the time. Then in organizations that have high availability requirements, you'll see what I mentioned earlier in the always on availability groups, where you'll have multiple BizTalk servers laid down and multiple SQL servers backing it that allow you to have that clustered failover and real-time failover without any downtime. And that answer doesn't get into disaster recovery, but that's kind of another topic on top of that is moving into what disaster recovery looks like for BizTalk.
And then I've got one more question. Earlier you did a demo about Azure integration, but is it possible for BizTalk to integrate with AWS?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Obviously, AWS is still the 800-pound gorilla, so it were, on the cloud market. The answer is yes. BizTalk can definitely be used to integrate with AWS services. There are a few third-party adapters that are built for BizTalk that can integrate with S3, specifically for S3 buckets, which is Amazon equivalent to Blob storage. And addition to that, a lot of scenarios with AWS where BizTalk would be leveraged are going to be through APIs. So inside of AWS, you've stood up a REST API or a web service of some sort. It might be through a Lambda function. In the scenario that I used previously, I was using an Azure function. It could be a Lambda function that stood up in AWS, which is kind of a synonym product in AWS that BizTalk could use as an entry point to integrating with an AWS ecosystem. So the answer is some third-party adapters and APIs are probably the way that I would look to integrate with AWS. Great. Anything else there?
That's all the questions we have.
All right. Is this my last slide? Indeed it is. Well, it looks like I'm going to give you guys about 20 minutes of your life back. But thank you guys for attending. I hope this has been helpful for you. I hope this has been informational. And everybody stay safe, and we will see you soon. Take care.